Spirited Away was like being brought to America, like Harvey Weinstein was a big kind of proponent of that, but he wanted it recut for like, maybe
Oh
to make it more
yeah.
accessible and more
Oh
marketable.
my god.
And so maybe his Burger King is Harvey Weinstein. I don't know.
Hello, welcome back to the Fifth Star. I'm Jamie,
I'm Albert.
and this is a podcast where we are trying to find our next 5-star rated movie. And once we find that movie that we can agree upon, this podcast will fade into oblivion.
Yeah, we are today discussing The Boy and the Heron.
Yes.
Hayao Miyazaki. He came out of retirement again and gave us another movie from Studio Ghibli. So I was wondering, what was your first Miyazaki movie? How old were you?
Ooh.
And what was that experience like? Do you remember which one you saw first?
That is such a good question, and I am struggling to remember what the first one was.
I don't remember exactly either. So
think-
if it was a couple options, what would the potential
I think
ones
it
be?
was Spirited Away, and I know I was in like high school.
Okay.
I think I was in 9th grade. I'm pretty sure it was Spirited Away, and I remember thinking it was really weird, but at the same time mesmerizing because the animation, the whimsy of all the characters in the world is like it very much like pulls you in.
Yeah.
But then I remember thinking like this is really weird and confusing.
So you weren't the biggest fan initially.
I like still wanted to watch all his other movies though.
Okay. So I think for me, it might have also been Spirited Away. I was in college, but it might also have been Princess Mononoke. I was in high school when that came out, and I can't remember if I saw Spirited Away first and then went, oh, like I want to watch this other movie, Princess Mononoke, but I think I might have seen Princess Mononoke first, and I don't remember it standing out that much. I mean, the animation was great, but the story, I don't remember it being that captivated by it. But
It's like
then
the most violent one.
yeah, and then when I watched Spirited Away in college, that was kind of eye-opening. It was so amazing. I was like, I've never seen an animated film or many films like this at all. So at that point, it became an instant classic for me. So that's one of my 5-star movies, one of the movies that I've given that 5th star.
Dang.
And yeah, I love that one.
Dang.
And I feel like sometimes I'm curious about this because I wonder is Miyazaki movies are kind of their own thing.
Yeah.
They have their
It's
own
like their own
kind of
genre.
Yeah, and their own feel, and he has this special quality that he brings to his movies. So I kind of wonder, is like the first one you see often the favorite, and then everything else is always like kind of getting back to that? But that wasn't the case for you.
No, Castle in the Sky is my favorite. It still is. There's something so like beautiful about that story because it's so simple, but at the same time, the world is so complex. And then the plot very much meanders like most Ghibli movies, but I just love that movie. So that's my favorite, and I think that was the 3rd, maybe the 4th one I saw.
Okay,
So,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, today we are reviewing The Boy and the Heron.
Yep.
It was originally titled in Japanese How You
Are
Live,
you gonna say it?
I
Oh,
believe. Yeah.
I thought you were gonna say it in Japanese.
I don't speak Japanese. I did take Japanese for a year in high school, but I can't speak it. So The Boy and the Heron is, it's about a boy. His name is Mahito, and I think I can say this because it happens very early in the movie, but his mom dies. And then he moves with his father out of Tokyo. This is happening during World War II.
Yep.
And then he meets his new mom, his stepmom. And then basically it's kind of like about him in this new house, kind of new mom, and kind of adjusting to that. And then all of a sudden his stepmom is kind of missing. And then he goes after her and then falls into kind of this very fantastic world. So yeah, that's basically the kind of premise of the movie.
Yeah, that was good.
And we wrote down on the other side of these whiteboards what we gave it secretly. We're going to now guess what each other gave it. So I think you gave it a 3.5, I'm gonna guess. I mean, I know you really love Miyazaki, so I feel like you're gonna. I just can't see you going lower than like a 3 on this, just out of principle. But yeah, what do you think I gave it?
Oh, I think you gave it a 2.
Okay.
I think that's what I said about the last one as well.
Yeah.
I just like have a pretty strong feeling that you hated it. I could be completely wrong because you keep surprising me.
I mean, this is a very. I mean, we can just say this out the outset. It is a very confusing movie at points.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of room for interpretation, so I feel like that's going to be a fun part of the discussion. But yeah, what were your initial thoughts?
All right, so without going into spoilers until we reveal our scores, my initial thoughts were it felt very close to home for Miyazaki. It kind of felt because like he was born during World War II, and that's kind of the setting and how like his mom dies in a like hospital fire, and at the same time the movie kind of like is really focusing on grief for the majority of it. You know, Miyazaki went through a lot of similar emotions, I think, throughout his life. And so this movie, if it really is his last one, it feels like the most Miyazaki way to go out, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So.
And so did you like it overall? Not like it?
Well, am I allowed to say that? Like, yeah, I feel like I should wait.
I already gave you a guess. I want to know how close my guess is. I can't read from what you're initially saying.
I know. I'm trying to keep it vague on purpose.
Well, then I'll go. I'll say I love the way the movie starts out. It starts out in the real world. I mean, it kind of reminded me of Up, like the opening of Up, where, you know, it's very, in a short amount of time, they give you a lot of information, but it's packed with a lot of emotional punch. And so you see Mahito, I mean, he like, all of a sudden, there's like a fire going on at night, and then his dad's like running towards the fire, and it's like his mom's hospital, and you see him, Mahito, like just making a mad dash for the hospital while all these flames are going on through the crowds. And the animation during that scene when he's running through the crowds with the flames and the fire and everything's like smearing and stuff,
that was cool.
Was so amazing. I was blown away, and it had that kind of haunting, and then like if it wasn't just like visually stunning and arresting, but it was emotionally also, and I could feel like his desperation and just just how overwhelmed he must have felt.
And I feel like the smoke like does kind of create that like mirage illusion too. So it's kind of cool that it was sort of like, not only is this very haunting, but it's also like maybe kind of more realistic.
Yeah. It was realistic yet surrealistic, and then all at the same time. So I was just so captivated right out of the get-go. And then it goes boom, jumps, and then he says like, so then my mom died, and then a year later we like moved out of Tokyo, you know? And it was just such a jarring but gripping start to the story. And then it doesn't let up. Like the next scene, they're getting off a train, and then he's meeting his now new mom, who she reveals that she's pregnant, right? They're expecting a child. So it was just like, wow. Like I felt overwhelmed as a viewer. I can't imagine this boy, you know, and how he must feel if this is kind of Miyazaki and in some ways autobiographical, which we'll talk about it later. You know, kind of does really capture like as a child, like having to deal with all these kinds of things, like how hard that must be. And so I really loved all of that, the setup. And then I think, can we get to the Heron and the kind of reveal, or is that a spoiler?
The Heron. Freaking Robert Pattinson. Did you watch the dub?
So we watched the dub because
Robert Pattinson. It didn't sound anything like him, right? The entire time I was like, this is not Robert Pattinson.
Yeah.
This is not Robert Pattinson.
Yeah. I mean, the only voice, because I wasn't thinking about who they were. I think Christian Bale registered.
Yeah.
And then David Bautista also
and Willem
registered.
Dafoe.
Oh, yeah. I wasn't really thinking about Willem Dafoe, but that makes sense. I could hear that too. But I think this is in the trailer. So there's this heron flying around, this gray heron bird, and then at one point, like he confronts the heron, and
Yeah.
then like it reveals that there's like another creature. It's like a fantastical creature, and then there's like this really
Yeah.
trippy sequence
Yeah.
where now all these frogs start climbing and jumping all over Mahito, and then so you think that he's like dreaming about all this
Yeah.
because he's hit his head and he's like kind of might be under a concussion, and so you're not really exactly sure what's reality and what's not. But it seems like it's kind of a dream because then he's back in bed.
Yeah.
And then he goes to the closet and then he sees the little stick that he was trying to attack the heron with, and it's still there.
And it's intact.
Yeah, it's intact. But then he goes and picks it up.
And it falls apart.
And then it falls apart like the way it did in his vision.
Right.
So now you're like, wait, did that really happen? And so that all was so captivating, and I was like really loving that.
And then the arrow as well. She like fires an arrow.
Oh yeah.
And then he finds her bow and arrow like in the house.
Oh, he does see the bow and arrow. Oh, when he goes to see her, the bow and arrow sitting there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's all these like kind of clues dropped in of like, is this really happening? Is it not? And I thought that part was really fascinating. But then he eventually like goes into this tower. There's like this mysterious tower, right? That's kind of off limits. And then so he goes kind of after his stepmom into the tower, and then it just goes further and further, deeper and deeper into kind of this fantasy world, right?
Yeah.
And by the end, you're just in. I mean, you don't really have any bearing of what's going on and what world you're in. So yeah, we'll get all of that into the spoilers, and there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
But I would say generally, I almost felt like the more fantasy it got, the more the movie kind of lost me. And it reminded me of a lot of, I think, Spirited Away at different points.
Yeah.
And some other things like My Neighbor Totoro, when he's like goes into the forest for the first time, it like replicates like the same shot from one of the compositions in My Neighbor Totoro. So there's a lot of callbacks that he does to his older movies. But after a certain point, I was just getting so confused as to like, what the heck is going on? Who is this? And why is this the case? And yeah.
I'm glad you brought up like Spirited Away, because I remember like the first time I watched Spirited Away, I felt the same way, where I was like, I'm so confused. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Like, what are the beats of the story? And even to this day, like when I rewatch it, like I'm still, like I said earlier, very much pulled into the world.
Yeah.
But like so lost about like what the point of it is, and like wanting to understand more of like the message.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
And I felt like similarly with this one. I like am confused, but also mesmerized. So interesting how he's able to pull that off.
Yeah, it is similar in that sense, but for some reason, Spirited Away like was captivating, and I didn't feel like as lost in it.
Interesting.
Like I felt like it was still, I'm following this girl into this new world on this kind of journey as we, all these fantastical elements are unpacked, but she's trying to find like her and rescue her parents who are like turned into pigs. For some reason, like it kept me connected as it got deeper and deeper into that world. Whereas in this movie, it has a similar structural setup, right? Like he's going deeper and deeper to try to find his stepmom and rescue her. But
very similar.
As it kept going, it started losing me because maybe it just got a little too weird at points and too random. Like it almost felt like really disconnected. Whereas Spirited Away felt like it was still part of one world in a way. I don't know if you felt like that at all. Like Spirited Away, like all the different fantastical elements still seem like they fit together. But this one, like, we'll unpack the details later, but like, I mean, it goes from one end to like a totally different end, and
well, there's just the twin old ladies that turn into birds.
Yeah,
like that was similar to me of like the blue heron. It's like they turn into birds, and like the way that they were, I don't know.
Oh yeah,
like
yeah,
so much
true.
of that, and then like they keep sending her on these like random side quests. And then there's this random like dragon boy, and there's like a lot of like weird elements that feel disconnected.
Oh, that felt disconnected for you in Spirited Away?
I think so. I think
Huh.
I had to watch that movie 3 times before it like really sank in.
Mm.
But it was a good movie. I really liked it.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to like throw shade at
Yeah.
it. I just like had a hard time following.
Yeah. I just remember.
So I felt very similarly during this one.
Okay. Yeah. At the end of Spirited Away, I was just like, wow, that was just, I don't know what all of that was, but I was just so captivated and
Interesting.
mesmerized.
Yeah.
This at the end, I was like, huh? You know? And it's a different kind of experience. Like,
It's
so at the
fascinating.
end of the day, I was, I don't know. It was kind of a mixed bag for me.
Dang.
There's
Did you give it a 2.5?
So do we
actually
want to reveal?
Good, yeah.
I don't know if there's anything else we want to say beforehand.
I feel like we have to really get
really
into the
unpack
weeds.
it, right? Yeah. One thing I want to say is I did like Mahito. Did you
Yeah.
like him as a protagonist?
Yeah, I didn't like him at first, but I think that's because he didn't like say anything really.
Okay.
Like he had like so few lines, but you do feel very like sympathetic towards him because I mean, he loses his mom, then he loses his home, then he has to go to this new school, and the new school is terrible.
Yeah, because the kids are like bullying him. Because
Yeah. So you
he's
feel
a
like
new
really
kid.
sympathetic towards him, but at the same time, I felt like I didn't get to see his personality until like more towards the end.
Oh, okay.
And then his personality really started to come out. So
I really liked him. Like, I think he kind of kept me still
That's
in
good.
it because I don't know if it's because I'm a guy and, you know, I remember what it felt like to be young at that age. And, you know, I had a lot of different things going on with my family and my parents and, you know, moving and all these kinds of things, you know, like, so I kind of related to him in that sense, like, you know, as he struggles to make sense of all these the real world and the brokenness of the real world and these kind of like things that you would hope that a child doesn't have to experience. Now, nothing to his level, like it wasn't like death and things like that, but
Yeah.
yeah. So, and then he also was like a very resourceful kid. Like, you know, early on, he like fashions a bow, like, and, you know, bow and arrow kind of out of all these
Bamboo.
little the separate parts and stuff like that. And he's also very brave consistently throughout the whole movie.
Yeah.
Just like wants to go rescue like his stepmom and kind of is unfazed and, you know, by even things that are very confusing and scary. So I thought that was very admirable. So yeah, like I liked him as a character, and I think he kind of gave some grounding to the whole thing. So at the end of the movie, I felt like I still got something out of. I was able to make sense of all of that. I think because of him as a character, like he was written well as like a lead character.
I was wrong.
So, okay, do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
All right, so you guessed that I gave it a 2.0 out of 5. And again, if this is your first time viewing, if we both give this a 5.0, this is our last podcast. And this is a Miyazaki film, so it has the potential to do that. But you guessed I gave it a 2.0 out of 5, and I gave it a 3.0. Yeah.
Darn it.
Yeah.
I have not been getting even close.
Yeah, you've been
lately.
off kind of lately, but these are harder ones to guess.
Well, especially because I think I'm going off of you know, previous conversations.
Yeah, I think you're assuming that because I really didn't like the Zone of Interest because
Yeah, anything poetic now.
You're
I
just assuming,
assume you hate.
Yeah. But I don't think that's the case. I think there needs to, if I get what the author's trying to say to some degree, I get something out of it. I don't hate the movie. But
Do you still think I gave it a 3.5?
I'm not sure from what you're saying. You're not really revealing your cards, but I'll stick with 3.5. Oh, yes! I'm on a roll.
You've been on a roll, and it's making me mad.
I got the last one. I nailed the last one.
I know. I think you beat me now. I think you're ahead of me
Really?
because you've guessed correctly 3 times. And I think
Yeah.
I've only guessed yours twice.
Whoa!
I
Making
think
a
so.
comeback.
Dang.
My daughter's gonna be so proud of daddy. No, because I felt like you would also be confused by it too. But
Here's the thing: I was actually bordering on a 4.
whoa,
Between a
okay,
3.5
okay.
and a 4.
Well, I'm glad I gave it a 3.5 then.
And this is mainly why. So
Okay, spoilers.
the
We're going to
movie,
spoilers.
yeah. So the movie was very, highly metaphorical.
Yeah,
Highly.
yeah.
That's why it was so confusing. I
Mhm.
think because so much of it was like hinging on metaphor and like you understanding the metaphor.
Mhm.
And so I kept the whole time I was like trying to guess it. Like, okay, I think it's this. So from the get-go, I was like, okay, it's gonna be about grief. Because
Yeah.
obviously this kid is like grieving the loss of like pretty much everything.
Yeah.
So this world is maybe an embodiment of his grief. And it's something that he's like trying to explore / hang on to.
Mhm.
And so by the end, so we learn that his great uncle is the one who like kind of helped create the tower
Yeah.
and like the world.
Yeah.
And so his great uncle offers him like, I would like for you to inherit this. And I was like, he better turn it down. Like I really wanted him to turn it down because if my theory was correct, he needed to let go of his grief in order for him to like find resolution and like become attached to his new life. Because if he kept holding on to this made up world, he'd never be able to like, you know, accept his new world in his new house with the new school and everything.
Yeah.
So I was very proud when he was like, no, I'm going back to my place and with my stepmom, and like he embraces his new life.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was like really good and really well done. But I just wish it had been a little more straightforward. And so I ended up kind of going down to a 3.5 because I felt the same thing when I finished the movie. I sat on the couch and I was like, what?
Yeah. Like, I kind of think
Like,
I know what this was
think-
about,
But there's still some pieces that aren't quite clear.
yeah.
Like the meteor thing was weird.
I mean,
Why did it have to be a meteor?
I mean, there were so many. Well, the meteor thing I thought was interesting because I was like, is this like a double for or a metaphor for like the atomic bomb? You know, like something coming out
Oh.
of the sky and then it sets things on fire, right? But then it's like building a tower
didn't
around
think
it.
about that.
So, because, you know, it takes place during World War II.
Right.
So, but then I was trying to track the rest of it from that point to that metaphor, and I was like, no, it doesn't work. It kind of falls apart. So I don't think that's what it was.
Right.
This movie, in a weird way, reminded me of Inception.
What?
Yeah. So
Okay.
on the one hand, like Inception also ends where you're kind of like, huh, like what was real, what wasn't real? You know, it kind of leaves you with that kind of question. And I feel like that was similar to this, but also like, so you have the real world where Mahito and his dad and
Mojito.
and then his the old ladies, you know, so that's like the real world, and that's kind of like in also Inception, like
Yeah.
the top level, and then he goes into the tower, and then there's a whole scene that happens in the tower where you kind of get a glimpse of the great uncle, the master of the tower, and then
he goes deeper.
yeah, and then
Yeah, I see what you're
you
saying.
sink down under the ground,
Yeah.
and then it goes into this kind of like more dream world. So that seems almost like second, and the tower is like the second level of the dream, and then underneath is like the third
Yeah.
level, and then it just like as you go deeper and deeper in, it just gets more and more crazy and unhinged and fantastic. And then the end, you're not really sure like what was what, and so it kind of reminded me of that. But I also, at the end of the day, kind of got a similar takeaway as you. I do feel like it was about grief. It felt like he was wrestling with the loss of his mom, and he meets, you know, again spoilers, but the fire lady, the Miss Himi, it
Yeah.
turns out to be like
His
a young
mom.
version of his mom, and then it's revealed that his stepmom's is actually his aunt, right?
Which I feel like they actually revealed that early on.
Oh, did they? I missed that.
Well, when she's talking about the great uncle, she says our great uncle.
Oh, okay.
And so it's like, okay, clearly they're related, but I'm not sure how.
Yeah.
And then it's like, she must be the aunt.
Yeah, and then everyone's like the old ladies are like, oh, the resemblance is uncanny, you know.
Yep.
He looks just like his mom, and
Yep.
yeah. So and that whole part of it kind of weirded me out a little. I'm like, okay, dad, you just lost your wife, you marry your sister-in-law, and then within a year, like marry her and then have another kid. It was just kind of a little like, ooh. But it might have been more common in, you know, back at that time and, you know, stuff like that. So anyway, so that aside, I also thought that, you know, as he's going through this kind of world, at the end of it, like he's always saying like, I'm looking for Natsuko. So he's like, where's Natsuko? And I have to find Natsuko, right? And then when he kind of like finally finds her and then like has a confrontation with her, he actually calls her mother for the first time at the end. So to me, that symbolizes and signifies that he's wrestling, with this kind of new relationship and how do I relate to her? Like, is she my mom? Is she not my mom? Like, I have a stepdad and I kind of had to come to terms with that. Like, who is this new person in my life, right? Like, do I call him dad? Do I not call him dad? And so that is like another thing you kind of have to deal with as like a child, right? So he's kind of going through that journey.
Yeah.
And then in the end, it feels like he's kind of coming to acceptance with that.
Yeah.
And then it ends on the scene of like his new family with his younger brother who's now born and older. And so, yeah, like him coming. So it's kind of his journey of coming to terms with that and letting go of his mom.
One scene that kind of maybe disappointed me because I made an assumption that turned out to be wrong. When he does finally find his stepmom in the world, it really does seem like she's in deep, deep grief of her own. And we don't understand why. And so I completely thought she had a miscarriage.
Oh.
And
that would make sense.
And it would have been so touching because then the mom, who's a little girl, is like, please let Mahito be the son. And basically be like, replace
up her new
because like now he has a new mom and she has like a new child.
Oh yeah.
And so I thought like I almost cried at that part because I was like, that's so beautiful.
So like,
but then later,
in that grief, like they're finding each other.
Yeah,
right?
and plus she's like, I hate you.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, why would she say that unless she was grieving like a great loss of her own? And I also thought like, oh, that's why she's in the tower. It's because she's like also entered into grief for the loss of her child. You know, so I was like really thinking I was onto something.
Yeah.
And then it turns out like, no, the baby is actually fine and there is no miscarriage and then the baby's born. And I'm like, okay, wait. So why did that whole scene happen? Like I got so confused because I was so caught up in my own assumption, I guess.
Yeah.
That I was like, okay, why did she say I hate you? And like that was so odd.
This is kind of the problem because on a big picture, I do feel like we got the same thing out of it. But
did you think that too?
No, I did not think that.
Okay.
But I think in terms of like this being about his grief and him coming to terms with a new mother and things like that. But when you start getting into the details, the whole thing just seems to unravel, kind of like this world, right? I mean, we didn't even talk about these characters, but like there's a whole set of like this army of parakeets, right? Led by the parakeet king. And I personally did not like the parakeets. Like once we got to the parakeets,
were funny, but
they were kind of funny. Like with the swords, knives behind them, and they're like just wanting to eat the humans. And but I actually felt like the parakeets tonally felt so not Miyazaki. Like it almost felt like DreamWorks or something. Like
interesting.
Yeah, to me, Miyazaki has like a fantasy, but also like this innocence and. It deals with the real like things, but there's something about the parakeets that felt like almost like Psycho, like, you know, or The Shining, or, you know, like, I don't know, like more of a horror theme that just didn't really feel like it fit. And they were just so random. I don't know. So I didn't really like that. And then it's like, so what do they mean? You know, why, what do they represent and who are they? And then like, who's their great uncle? And, you know,
oh,
yeah. What's your theory on the great uncle?
I've got a big theory.
Okay.
So, when I watched this with my husband again, and he had a theory that Miyazaki was both the boy and the uncle.
Okay.
and that the uncle is, Miyazaki's constantly entering into retirement.
Oh, okay.
So he's constantly like weaving these worlds together, building these worlds, and then now he's like getting to a point where he's too old and he needs to like hand it off and basically entrust his legacy to like the next sort of generation.
Yeah.
So there was like this whole theory of like, oh, if he is Miyazaki, then what does that say about like the whole movie and the world? Because the great uncle keeps sort of pulling people from his, like pulling his family members into his world.
Yeah.
And like kind of keeping them there and
Yeah.
like sort of controlling the narrative.
And he says like his successor has come from his bloodline.
Yeah,
right?
like his bloodline. So it's like, it's very much like trying to maintain sort of control over this world.
Yeah.
or
That
this
he's
legacy
created, right?
that he's created.
Yeah.
And so it sort of feels like Miyazaki sort of realizing like, oh, this maybe isn't super healthy to like, I don't know, hang on to it like that.
Yeah.
But then also we were thinking like, is it possible that Miyazaki is like starting to forget stuff because he's older?
Oh, interesting.
And there's no proof of that. So this is all just a theory.
Because when they come out of this world, they finally escape and everything, and that world crumbles. The Heron does say everyone eventually forgets. Right?
Yeah. So I was wondering if like maybe that was his little Easter egg, maybe that he's like starting to forget like the things that he's built, or the things that he's made. And the fact that like he's building that tower and he's like, okay, it'll last one more day. This could all be gone tomorrow. Kind of thing. I don't know.
So that's a very interesting take. And I actually did look up and read up on what the real story is behind all of this. But I didn't.
Well, I looked up Miyazaki's life. That's all I wanted to look up.
Okay.
So I looked up his whole like biography.
Okay. So what connections have you seen from that?
Well, I thought it was interesting that like his relationship with his son is really like distant because he prioritized his work over his family, and like his wife basically raised the kids on her own, and so he has almost no relationship to his son, and his son like really loves the work that his dad has made, but sort of doesn't think he was the best father in a way. Yeah, and I thought that kind of related to this movie a bit too.
Yeah. So Miyazaki said that this was going to be an autobiographical story. And so he actually stated that.
Checks out.
Yeah,
okay.
He actually stated that early on. I think he did grow up during World War II.
Yeah, he was born in 42.
Oh, okay.
So like right in the middle of it.
Yeah. So right at that point in the war. His dad actually did build airplanes and stuff for the war.
Right.
So that was the same. His mom didn't die young, from what I read, but was sick with tuberculosis, and he was worried about her dying.
Right.
You know,
her spine. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was also a parallel. And then one of the theories that I heard. So actually, what Miyazaki kind of inferred to the producer Suzuki, and then Suzuki later like kind of has said in interviews and stuff like that, is that that mojito symbolizes
Mojito.
that mojito does symbolize Miyazaki, and that the heron actually symbolizes the producer, so Suzuki. And the way that is meant to unpack is that him and the producer have like almost like a love-hate relationship. Like they need each other, and then like without the producer, like these films can at the end of the day never fully get made, you know, like so he needs someone who's kind of going to help him guide him through this creative process. Otherwise he might be so caught in like this little hole of like, you know, creative whatever, but at the same time there's like this tension of like deadlines and, you know, all these kinds of things. So because of that, at the end, like the boy and the heron, right, they end up being friends, right, through this journey. But they are sometimes at odds with each other. And so that seemed like that
Interesting.
It was what is symbolizing. And then that the great uncle, it actually symbolized his co-founder of Studio Ghibli, Takahata. Yeah, I think is his name. I forget exactly how to say his name, but yeah. So now, early in his career, like that guy, he actually was like a director, and Miyazaki was kind of under him as like an artist, and kind of looked up to him, almost like idolized him in a sense. But and so he apparently like would make movies like just to try to win his approval, right? And that guy also would kind of not give him his full approvals because he would try to be like challenging Miyazaki to like push himself even more, you know? So they had this like really interesting relationship. And then later they ended up kind of becoming peers and being co-founders of Studio Ghibli. And so during when he started making Boy and the Heron, started drawing it and all that kind of stuff, that guy died. And so this movie almost is like him dealing with the grief of this person who's been so instrumental in his life as an artist, and him learning to deal with letting go of that, right?
Wow.
So there's a lot of that kind of thing. So that's kind of like one take that kind of comes from some parts of reputable sources involved with the film. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but to me personally didn't really like mean anything, right? Because I didn't really get that.
Oh, so that's just a take. That's not actually.
Well, that's from the producer of the film telling
okay.
us through kind of his talks with Miyazaki, and you know, so that kind of thing. And then there's a lot of references within the movie to his older works.
Yeah.
And so
There definitely is.
there's another take that I heard from some other reviewer that I thought was interesting, which is very in line with what your husband was saying, that actually that the great uncle is Miyazaki, and that this world is kind of representing all
His
of the
work.
movies. Yeah, all of his works. And that's why there's, you know, as they go into this fantasy world, that there are all these references to Porco Rosso and Spirited Away and, you know, yeah, like Totoro, and you know, it's all of his kind of movies. And then one reviewer actually was saying that if you count the blocks, that there's 13 of them. And from what I was looking at his filmography, there's 12 movies, including Boy and the Heron. And then the 13th could be the TV show, the first show that
The panda one?
no, the Boy Conan one.
Oh.
Yeah. And so that one like is where Miyazaki was like first starting to like direct like episodes and draw and stuff like that. And then that his co-founder was also like working on. And so that kind of like helped shape like their thing. And so there's some interesting stuff there. So those 13 blocks might be his works. And
That's
then
interesting.
what he's doing is trying to find a successor. Now that he's coming to the end of his life, that he's trying to find a successor to hand this down.
Right.
But dealing with the fact that he wants to hand it to his son.
But he doesn't have a good relationship with his son.
Yeah. And his son also doesn't have the same gifting that he has.
Right.
And him dealing with that and kind of understanding that like with his death, his kind of world that he's created and his dynasty is going to crumble with it, you know?
Speaking of the tower though, again, I thought it was so interesting how they kept pointing out that some of the stones had malice or whatever.
Yeah.
And we were sort of talking about how if some of his tower is built with malice, does that mean like some of his inspiration for his work came from a place of anger? I think you definitely see that with like Princess Mononoke or like maybe Nausicaa, where like his anger that we're destroying the planet or his anger about, you know, World War II and the tragedies there, like that actually helped inspire some of his works. And it kind of feels like that's like his malice or whatever.
Yeah. Or even
and
like
then,
Porco Rosso, like even though it's humorous, like
there's malice there.
Yeah, like the pilot could be his like dad, right? He's involved with flying planes and being a plane maker, right? An engineer, but he's represented as like a pig, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, there might be some kind of like animosity and anger towards his dad that he's kind of putting out cathartically, right?
And then he references how Mahito references how the malice is hit the rock he hit himself with. And so it's like this constant reminder of like the tragedy that he went through. And that kind of ties into the whole how grief shapes you as a person. and how grief like stays with you, but the only way to heal from grief is time. So I did think those themes actually tied in really well together. You just had to really think about it.
Yeah.
For the pieces to
Yeah.
work.
And that's the thing, like
your brain hurts.
Yeah, like reading up on this, I'm really impressed that like that your husband actually did make that kind of connection of like the great uncle being like being
Miyazaki.
Yeah. Like I didn't get that from my viewing, and so like I don't know, like reading up on this stuff, I think it's interesting, and it's interesting when an author, and for him like a true auteur, right, controlling every part of the process, like totally puts yourself in your art, and you can't help but for art to unearth some part of like the artist, right?
Yeah.
And being connected to real things that they've experienced. But like for me as a viewer, like I wasn't really getting any of those things like out of my viewing, right? So a lot of it I felt like was kind of lost on me, and it didn't really connect in those ways.
Okay, the parakeets are super random.
Yeah.
We can't like figure out what they are for. So like I don't know, what could they represent? Like if we were to unpack it.
I don't know. So if I'm working under that kind of going along with the interpretation of Mahito is, or the great uncle is Miyazaki.
It's Miyazaki.
And this is like his world he's created, and
right.
these blocks maybe are symbolizing all of his works that are being held kind of together. So maybe the parakeets are like the audience members, like the viewers, and there's kind of a, everyone comes in droves to watch his movies and stuff, but also like with a knife behind their back, right? Like ready to slash it and tear it apart, maybe. I don't know. And
consumers.
Oh,
consuming.
That's right. They do consume.
Are we the parakeets?
Well, are we the parakeets, or are we like maybe the parakeet king? Like, is the parakeet king like critics? Because, or like, instead of just the average viewer, like a critic that comes and tries to be like, oh, this is what your work means, and tries to like because doesn't that the parakeet king do that? Like tries to like restructure it or something, and then it falls apart. And
well, he tries to keep it built.
Oh, yeah.
So it could also be like the studios, or like the franchise, or I don't know, like the big corporations.
Oh, like
trying to keep it alive for as long as possible.
So like he's built his kind of own world that's separate, that he doesn't want it to be part of that machine, the consumerism and all that. But
that is very Miyazaki.
Yeah, but then I guess like, so is the parakeet king Disney? I mean, he kind of does seem like a Disney character, right?
How can I make more money?
Yeah. And then like is trying to
flatter the uncle and stuff.
Yeah.
And like keep him in good graces. That is actually that's a good point, because the parakeet, it seems like they're friends, but it also seems like they're enemies.
Like there's a respect.
Yeah.
Right?
There's like you clearly like have the vision.
Yeah.
But I need you to make more. And I need you to keep it alive. Yeah.
There's
my livelihood depends.
So apparently there's this kind of whole story about when Spirited Away was like being brought to America. Like Harvey Weinstein was a big kind of proponent of that, but he wanted it recut for like, maybe to make it more accessible and more marketable.
Oh my god!
And so maybe American King is Harvey Weinstein. I don't know, but yeah, someone who's trying, any force that's trying to restructure.
Yeah.
Like Miyazaki wants his work to stand on its own, like this tower. As precarious as it might be, right? Like no one really knows what it means and all that, like even like what we're trying to do. But he finds a certain beauty and balance in that, maybe.
Yeah.
Right? But the person who comes and
tries to replicate it.
Yeah, or make it in his own structure and make it in his own way, that's like, and then it falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
That's I think kind of interesting.
If they're trying to like rip off of it. Or like the fact that we're and this gets into a deeper conversation, but like the fact that we're sort of in a culture of like sequels and remakes, and it's like kind of money grabbing, where we're essentially saying, okay, we can't like come up with new original stories because we're not guaranteed the paycheck. So let's just keep making the same stuff and keep replicating. And a lot of the times that we've seen in the recent years is that does not work. And people are starting to notice and get irritated by it.
And this movie did really well. It's one of Ghibli's best performing movies. So I think like even though
it also beat the Disney movies at the Oscars.
Oh yeah, it won. That's right. It won the Oscar for best animated film, right?
Yeah.
So even though I gave it a 3.0, I can't help but be so thankful that this movie exists, right?
Oh wow.
Because you're right. Like it's such a refreshing alternative to the kind of cycle that Hollywood is in right now and these big studios. And Miyazaki's still like going to like he's never gonna remake something he's already made, right?
Yeah.
He's always gonna find something new and tell a new story. And the idea of like someone else, like imagine if Disney did a remake of any of his movies, like I would want to tear my eyes out. I mean, it would just be so like disgusting, right?
Yeah.
The idea of that. And so I think like there is that element of it, and the fact that he's dealing with his mortality, like he's already in his 80s.
Yeah.
He's already retired, right? Like these movies, this took like over 6 years, I think, to make. I mean, it's grueling, the process, like he's hand drawing everything. So the fact that when he dies, like, and he doesn't have a successor, like his son is not going to take over, it doesn't seem, right? So this world is going to die with him and the magic of all these kinds of original stories. So yeah, there's a lot at stake. And the question is like, where do movies go from here? Where do animated films go from here?
Yeah. Dang.
I don't know. Like even Disney, right? They're just doing live action.
You're like almost convincing me to give it a 4.
Oh no.
Might have to go up.
I actually kind of like my interpretation better, which I want to offer up to you. I have 2 interpretations of this film.
Okay.
Which is at the end of the day more simplistic, like we talked about, that it's him dealing with his grief.
Yeah.
But one is that it's all imagined and it's actually him reading the book that his mom gave him. So when you watch the movie, he's, you know, building the bow and arrow and stuff like that so he can take down this heron. And then he kind of sees his stepmother like walking out into the forest. And I think that really happens. Like, and maybe she was just going for a walk. And then, you know, when he's messing with the bow and arrow in his room, like it knocks over the books, right? And then that's when he starts picking up the books that he sees the book that his mom had written to him.
Right.
And so then he starts sits down and then he starts like reading through the book and he's crying. And then at that point, while he's reading, you start to see the old ladies outside start calling for the stepmom and looking for her. And then it kind of takes him away from the book. He looks out the window and says, "What's going on?" And he says, "I'll be down to help," right? And then when he runs out, like the shot hangs on the book at the table for like a minute, you know? And then he goes into the forest and then all the craziness ensues, right? And at the very end, after all of that, they come out of it and everything. And then the last thing he does is he's putting books away in his bag. And then one of the books is very quickly, you can see, is the book that his mom gave him. So one reading,
did not even catch that.
Yeah, so one reading of this could be that from the point that he opens the book to when he puts the book away, it's really just him like
experiencing the story.
Yeah, experiencing the story and in a way grieving the loss of his mom through this book. And so as an author, Jamie,
Interesting.
I think there is a reading of this that could be like part of our therapy, you know, could be in our kind of processing of real tragedy and things like that, could be in the worlds that these books can take us, right? And stories can take us. And so that's like one reading interpretation I have of the film. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think it lines up with sort of what we were talking about earlier too. Like the whole like, where does our inspiration come from? Sometimes it comes from uglier places, but like that can be very therapeutic.
Yeah.
Of like, oh, I'm, you know, super angry that this happened. I'm going to like allow it to influence my writing, and that could actually be a good decision because it could improve the story more. But then hopefully you're not sitting in that. You're allowing it to like move over you and move on.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, like you still need to like press through like Mahito does, and like like kind of get through to the other side of it, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost like like you have to, it's hard work.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be easy. That could be a potential reading of the film, but in a way it almost
So
like
you're saying reading.
yeah. No
We
pun
read
intended.
movies here, actually.
Yes. But it in some ways it kind of loses its magic for me, that interpretation. It's almost too literal. It's like,
Okay.
oh, he just imagined this in a book, he read it in a story, I don't know.
That's why it's left vague.
Yeah, and so I don't prefer that kind of interpretation. My favorite interpretation is probably so he reads the book and then he goes into look for his stepmom, and he actually goes into the tower. And really the rest of the movie is him, a boy, playing in this kind of abandoned tower and imagining just this fantasy world, and it's like his escape, right? So maybe his stepmom's not really missing, but he runs off into this tower, and I just picture in reality what's happening is Mahito is just in this tower, like dark tower by himself, and running around, running up and down the stairs. And then like, why are the parakeets? Because like they're parakeets and pelicans that have just, taken refuge, roosted in this abandoned tower. And he's imagining like, oh, that one's the king, and then now like this is happening. There's all this stuff with stones, right? Like picking up stones. So he's like picking up like these rocks and crumbled, stones, and like the tower itself is symbolic of like the big stone, and the world is not so much symbolic of grief itself, but more escapism, right? Like he's just escaping into this world as a way to process this grief. And then at the end, what he has to come to is he's faced with this point of, am I going to accept this world as my reality and stay in this world where I can control it and I can continue to create this kind of fantasy however I want it to be? Or am I going to reject that and go back into reality and kind of, now come out a little stronger, but be ready to like face the real world, right? And now take on my stepmom as my mother. Yeah. And so that's kind of like the other interpretation that I had of this that I kind of almost like better.
I feel like that is an interesting interpretation. I think it does still kind of work with the theme and everything. Yeah. My only thing would be, or my only pushback would be, there aren't enough clues to tell us.
I mean, all the birds could be there, right? Like the gray heron is just there, right? It's a real gray heron.
I feel like there needed to be, like, I don't know. There would need to be, like, the book theory works because there's like good clues there. Yeah. But this one doesn't work as well to me because there aren't enough reasons. It's too much of you having to put those pieces together. Yeah. And so that's why I'm like, I'm not sure that's really the intention. But
yeah, and it does kind of fall apart because at the end
the tower just gets destroyed.
Well, the tower crumbles, which could be symbolic, but he runs out, his dad sees him, right, and runs to him, but his stepmom is there with him. The old lady comes out of his pocket, right? And, so there are still these other pieces of like, well, so was the stepmom obviously wasn't there in the tower with him, the old lady wasn't, but maybe they were like going to look for him. And so it's kind of like them finding him and him coming out with them together. Mm-hmm. So it's not really one-to-one, but it's almost like the one that I think could make sense of why we see all these random elements.
Maybe it's a little bit of both.
Maybe it is. And this is where the part of the movie kind of at the end of the day loses me, is that it starts to get too unhinged, where whatever theory that you have eventually just falls apart, right? Because it gets so random. I mean, you're going from like space scenes to like these tunnels and hallways, that have like electric charge, and that's like has kind of sci-fi elements, to like parakeet worlds, and I mean it's just so all over the place that any attempt to try to make sense of anything just kind of feels frustrating. And so that's why I love the visuals. I think the visuals are fantastic and beautiful. But it at some point starts to feel like almost like he's trying to make just beautiful images just for the sake of making beautiful images. And is kind of like doesn't really care what they mean. And it feels too random and disconnected. And that's where the movie kind of, no pun intended, in the end crumbles for me. He builds up this world that is kind of fascinating, and it kind of falls apart under its own weight, under any kind of scrutiny or analysis, right? And maybe that's kind of not the point. Maybe the point isn't to be that literal, right? And I don't think Miyazaki would want us to be.
No, he never is. Like,
yeah.
People have been trying to figure out what the metaphor is for Spirited Away. I feel like for years and years and years, and no one's been able to like nail down a perfect one-to-one. There just isn't one, and I think Miyazaki's very intentional about that. Like, he doesn't want all of his stories to be like, oh, here's the message. I want it to be blatant and obvious.
Yeah.
And then also, he never follows like a normal story structure. Like, the fact that he doesn't write a script, he just does storyboards.
Yeah, I heard about that.
It's very much like he's just kind of going with vibes.
Yeah. He's being like, led by his muse, right?
Every time I watch a Ghibli movie, I'm like, I'm kind of here for the vibes.
Yeah.
Like, it's not necessarily about the plot so much, but at the same time, I do want the plot to be satisfying.
But so I don't think, and I don't know if you guys, how many Ghibli movies you guys have seen, but I don't think this movie is representative of all of his movies. Because I do think this is more open-ended than his other movies. I do feel like Spirited Away is more accessible. I think like My Neighbor Totoro is more accessible.
My Neighbor Totoro is just vibes.
Yeah,
but movie.
There are a lot of question marks there too. Like, who are these characters? These fantasy characters, are they real? But at the end of the day, it's about childhood, right? And even if they are imaginary, like, I think there is a theme. Then you walk away feeling like, I don't understand all the details, but I feel satisfied by it. I don't feel confused. I don't feel like I'm just left like befuddled.
I'm okay leaving it feeling confused though. Like, most of his movies leave me feeling confused, but it doesn't bother me too much.
Okay.
The only one that doesn't leave me feeling confused is probably Castle in the Sky, actually, because that plot is like very simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was about this specifically, but I think it just went too far, maybe. And so
I do think the metaphor holds up, though, about it being about grief.
I agree with that, and I'm glad that
holds up.
I think it's great that we both, at the end of the day, walk away with that.
Yeah.
Because I think when I listen to other people interpret this, it becomes too much of focusing on the literal, and it's too much about like his own autobiography and connecting every detail to his life. And while that's interesting, I think as a viewer, like, this is why I think the character Mahito being strong was important, because it keeps it grounded in his experience of what he's having to deal with.
Yeah.
And so the fact that we both walk away with, at the end of the day, this is a boy dealing with grief, and however he's doing that, through this world, we kind of get it at the end of it. So yeah, I definitely could have gone lower if that didn't even land on me, but because I had that, I feel good about what the point he was trying to get at. I just didn't enjoy the journey as much, I guess, because it was so confusing.
I was about to challenge your rating. I was like, the way that you're talking about it, it feels like you have such a high regard and respect.
It's fun to break down, but I think the experience of it just wasn't as enjoyable.
And when you guessed my rating, you pretty much were spot on. Like, I just don't think most Ghibli movies could just be average. They're just not, because they're in their own wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Like, how could it be an average movie?
I mean,
if it's so, like, outside of an average curve. I don't know.
Yeah, you almost have to rate them on their own curve. They're their unique thing.
Yeah, you kind of do.
Yeah, I guess this 3.0 is different than other 3.0s. It's not that I'm saying it's an average movie. It's that it's more... I was mixed.
You just couldn't quite figure out which side you leaned.
No, I was kind of mixed. So I'm gonna lock in at a 3.0, and yeah, you're gonna lock in at 3.5.
Yeah,
not a 4.0.
I really am right between. I'll be a 3.7.
No, we go on 0.5 scales.
I'm a 3.7.
You are breaking the structure of this podcast, Jamie.
I've ruined
it. It is not working with the tower and the blocks. Everything's falling apart now. Yeah. Well, let us know what you guys thought. I mean, let us know what you think of our takes. But there's a lot of fun in terms of the interpretive part of all of this and how you interpret art. So yeah, give us your comments.
And also, if you guys think of a movie that we maybe haven't watched,
you can check what we've seen on our Letterboxd. Yeah.
But if you think we would both like it and could potentially give it a 5 stars, let us know because we will add it to our watch list for sure.
Yes.
And you can follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and then, if you want to check our movies, Letterboxd.
Yeah, so every Thursday we'll be watching something. So next week we will be reviewing Kinds of Kindness. And so if you get a chance, watch that and join us next Thursday as we continue our quest for the 5th star.